If you're working in radians, it's very similar to working in degrees, except that a rotation, a complete revolution of the circle, that is, instead of being 360 degrees, it's 2 pi radians. So we've got to remember that. If we've got something that's 3 pi, for example, that's the same as having 2 pi plus pi. So pi would be the same as 3 pi radians. Or the cosine and the sine would be the same. Okay, in this example, example 3, we're asked to write the cosine of 5 pi over 4 as a trig ratio of an acute angle. Now, cosine of 5 pi over 4 is somewhere over here. Right, we know that because 4 pi over 4 is the same as pi, and we're just over that down here. Since it's in the third quadrant, it's going to have to be negative, right? Because both the cosine and the sine are negative down here. It's going to be the same, however, as the cosine of pi over 4. Right? So it's the same value as cosine of pi over 4, but it's over here instead, so it has to be negative. So the cosine of 5 pi over 4 is going to be negative cosine of pi over 4. And if you look back at your unit circle, remember the cosine of pi over 4 is root 2 over 2. So we're going to have in the end negative root 2 over 2. We can do similar things up here. Here we're asked to find the exact value of sine of 11 pi over 6. Now 11 pi over 6 is way down here. So that's going to be similar to the sine of pi over 6, which is way over here. Except that since it's down here, and since the sine is negative down here, we're going to have to make it negative. So it's going to be negative sine pi over 6. Therefore, it's going to be equal to negative a half. In example 5, we're asked this time for the tangent of 19 pi over 3. Now, 19 pi over 3 is a little bit difficult to think about. But if you imagine a rotation is 2 pi, and 2 pi is the same as 6 pi over 3. So if we go 6 pi over 3, 12 pi over 3, 18 pi over 3, then we just have another pi over 3 to add on to get up here. So this 19 pi over 3 is really just the same as pi over 3. So we can just take the sine and the cosine of pi over 3, which we've got in our unit circle. Right, they're root 3 over 2 and a half. Divide those two things, we can multiply top and bottom by 2, and you'll get in the end root 3 over 1, which is root 3. In example 6, we're asked to find the exact value of tan of negative pi over 6. Now, negative pi over 6 means you're going to be going not in an anti-clockwise fashion like this, but in a clockwise fashion like this. So this is negative pi over 6 way down here. So what we need for that, we need to do the sine of negative pi over 6 divided by the cosine of negative pi over 6. If you imagine what the x and the y coordinates are down here, they're really just the same as they are up here, but the y coordinate is going to be negative down there, so the sine is negative. So we're going to have negative a half divided by root 3 over 2. Refer back to your unit circle if you can't remember this. And then that's all going to be equal to negative 1 over root 3. And then we have a final example, which is a little bit more difficult. We have to do a little bit more work to answer this one. We're told the sine of something, and we're told where the angle is. And we've got to find out what the cosine and tangent are equal to. Now there's a trick to this. We've got to use this formula here, this sine squared plus cosine squared equals 1. We'll plug in negative 3 over 5 in for the sine. So if we do that, we'll get cosine squared of the angle equals to 1 minus the sine squared. If we simplify that, that's the same as having, if you do it, it'll be 25 over 25 minus 9 over 25, which should be 16 over 25. So it's 1 minus 9 over 25, which will be, in the end, 16 over 25. Now it's tempting for us then to say, okay, if the cosine squared is equal to that, then the cosine is going to be 4 over 5. But let's be careful. We always have to think that it could be positive or negative 4 over 5. Now think back. In quadrant 3, right, so because we're told that it's in quadrant 3 is way sort of down in this bottom left corner. Is the cosine positive or negative down here? It's negative. Right? So in quadrant 3, the cosine is negative. So the cosine is going to be negative 4 over 5. And then once we've got the sine and the cosine, it's easy to find the tangent. We just divide those two things, sine divided by cosine, and we'll get 3 over 4.